Hi, everyone. My name is David Chao. I direct the Center for Asian American Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary. It's my delight to introduce our podcast guest for today, Dr. Choi, who's the Kyungchik Han Chair, Professor of Asian American Theology at Princeton Seminary. Hi, Casey.
Hey guys, good to see you all.
Great
Nice to be
seeing
here.
you.
Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. And I'd love to introduce my co-host, Yanan Melo, who is a research assistant with the Center for Asian American Christianity. Hi, Yanan. How are you?
Hi, David. Doing great. Good to see you, Casey.
Good to see you, Yanan.
Yanan and I are really excited, Casey, to chat about your book, Disciplined by Race, Theological Ethics and the Problem of Asian American Identity.
How come I'm the only one without my
Yeah,
copy?
where's your copy?
I have no idea where my copy is. It doesn't matter.
You lent it out. You know, the book's been out since 2019, and it's had a very significant effect, especially in my own scholarship and research and reflection concerning Asian American identity and the issues of race and racialization. And I'm really excited just to have this podcast conversation to talk about the book, especially for those in our audience who have not heard of it or read it. This podcast could be kind of a cheat sheet into the book. They're going to have to buy a copy and explore it for their own. But I'd love to just talk about the book and the person behind the book, the journey that led you to the book. But maybe we could begin with just a more basic question. What's this book about?
Yeah, so maybe the way that I can talk about what this book is about is why I wrote the book, or at least the kinds of constituencies, if you will, that I had in mind. So first, when I started writing this book, so the book came out in 2019. I don't know. It took me probably 4 years, 4 years. Not continuous writing, but a lot of this was written, in cracks of time while I was busy doing a whole lot of other stuff. So over the course of 3, maybe 4 years, and as I was part of a number of conversations in the guild, so to speak, I identify primarily as a Christian ethicist, a theological ethicist, moral theologian, whatever term that you want to use. I was, along with a number of other friends and colleagues, were not entirely happy with the way in which our racial discourse was going, insofar as Asian Americans were really not part of the conversation, or if we were part of the conversation, it was kind of we were still kind of in a marginal, if you will, place in that conversation. So one thing that I had in mind was how do we get the discourse that's taking place in the guild to take seriously the racialized realities of Asian Americans, and so that's part of it, and you get a sense of the attention grabbing kind of ways that I try to do that with respect to some of my colleagues within the guild. So that's the primary. But the more and more I think about it, or the more and more as I was writing the book, to some extent, fellow Christian ethicists and theologians were they became less and less, if you will, the primary constituency. The primary constituency that emerged was fellow Asian Americans, and by that I mean both in the theological academy and just your quote unquote Asian American on the street. And so, and the reason why they were, or we, I should say, were on the top of my mind as I was writing this book is because, to some extent, I was dissatisfied with the way that we would talk about our own racialization or experiences of race. So, the one way that I like to put this, and sometimes it gets, I think, taken up in the wrong way, but the way that we talked about ourselves as Asian Americans and the way in which racism impacted us, I thought it was anemic the way that we did so. You know, and this is not to take away the felt reality of micro aggressions, or feelings of non-recognition, feelings of hitting, people talk about the glass ceiling, and for Asian Americans, the bamboo ceiling. I've always bristled at the way that that was characterized. But anyway, right, the idea that somehow we were being left behind too, in the workplace, that we weren't being included, all that sort, that kind of discourse. I thought, again, not to take away from the felt force and reality of that, didn't really capture the texture, the depths, the extent of the way in which racism impacts our lives. And in a way, I mean, the thing that I thought was missing was that we really weren't talking about our experiences in relation to these larger systemic forces that make our racial lives what they are. These racial forces are subtle in the way that I try to describe them. For some of us within the Asian American community, they are less than subtle. They're actually quite explicit and blunt, if I can put it that way. And I tried to talk about some of that, or at least alert us to some of that in the book. I'm always surprised at the number of Asian Americans who are not familiar with some of these key, if you will, events. No fault of their own, but I think I provide plenty of examples of the bluntness, if you will, of racial violence. But at the same time, I think part of the problem with our anemic racial discourse is that the role that racism plays in our lives is really quite subtle. And this is what I try to get at with this idea of the disciplining power of race in our lives. And so that subtleness, that nuance, that sort of, if you will, kind of a sinister casting of our lives, if I can put it that way, is what I think masks these larger systemic frames that are really at the root of the kind of racial experience that we have across the board. So so that's what I try to do in the book, and that captures some of the motivations behind the book.
Let
Yes,
me
David,
just,
I see you're raising your hand.
yeah, I know. Well, because I feel like before Yanan, because I know Yanan wants to go next, just to follow up. So Casey, I remember you gave a talk at SCE dealing with some of the inadequacies with DEI initiatives, and what I hear you saying about kind of a sort of predominating discourse about microaggressions and bamboo ceilings, and how these are inadequate to account for the more structural and deep yet somewhat hidden disciplining power of race and racialization. And I think a lot of us, ordinary Asian American Christians working in the corporate world or kind of in public spaces, our default language is DEI. Like, that is the predominant way race and equity get discussed. Do you want to just maybe comment on how some of the concerns of your book may not be adequately captured through things like DEI discourse?
Yeah, well, I mean, DEI discourse. Let's make this clear, is super important, right? I think we want to live and work in diverse places. Maybe this is more about me than some others, but I think generally speaking, right, we want to be treated equitably, and we want to be included in all aspects of life. So I don't have a problem with that. But what I have a problem is with when the discourse doesn't allow us to get at the roots of why diversity and equity and inclusion is so hard, right? Why we don't live, why so many of our spaces and environments are not diverse and not equitable and not inclusive, right? So So this is what I mean by, these larger systemic or structural forces. Um, you know, the question of here, I mean, why, why, why do we live the kind of lives that we live, right? And so there's something, you know, I don't want to say that our lives are facades, but I think to at least just kind of drive the point in a provocative or in a forceful way. I mean, there is a certain level of in which so much of our lives are artifices, right? And the question is, what's behind the constructed lives that we live. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. I guess I'm also just really curious about the writing process behind the book. So if I may ask, like, I'm curious if you could talk more about how it felt to you writing the book. What were some of the most enjoyable parts that you enjoyed writing about? And maybe what are some of the hard parts? How did you find inspiration? Were there any communities that supported you in the process? Yeah, just curious about some of that background.
Yeah, in terms of enjoy, look, I'll be, I will be upfront, and I think sometimes, I think a lot of us experience this, but sometimes we're just sort of timid to admit this. But but um, but I don't find writing enjoyable. Writing is hard. I'm jealous of those who find, who write, as eloquently as they speak. I'm just not one of those persons. And, for me, it really is a task. So, and, and then on top of it, to write about a subject matter that I think is fundamentally difficult, it just makes it much more challenging. But and so for me, once you get over that hump of the difficulty of writing, the challenge of writing, and things start clicking, that's when I find it enjoyable. But I just want to say up front, I don't find writing enjoyable. It's hard. But like I said, once things click, and the writing takes a life of its own, I think that's what's really exciting about writing. I often tell folks that you can make writing more difficult if you try to force your writing to actually say something that the writing doesn't want to say, right? And I thought that when I first wrote this book that I was going to end up in a very particular spot at the end. But I discovered that the writing, in a way, has a mind of its own, and it led me to a spot that I wasn't necessarily expecting. I think I end the book a little bit more circumspect and maybe pessimistic, and you know, um, and I wasn't necessarily expecting that. But again, if you allow the writing process to do its thing, it will take you in places that you don't necessarily was expecting. So, yeah. So I have no idea if I'm responding to your question, Yanan, because I may have just missed your question um, completely. But yeah, and then the other challenge was just trying to find the time to write, again, just because of a number of work and life circumstances at the time. Finding the time to write was difficult. But I will have to say that the challenging part of this was trying to figure out a way to write a book about a topic like this that would resonate with both academics and the person on the street, non-academics, if you will. And that took a little bit of more more thinking, if you will, and it required a certain level of actually strategic thinking, if you will. I struggled with how theory laden I should be in the book. I mean, there's plenty of theory here, but what I decided was I tried to kind of make the theoretical stuff a little bit. I tried to hide it. Well, no, hide it is not the right word. I tried to be a little bit craftier in how I presented the theoretical stuff, because again, I wanted this to resonate with non-academics, and it's still academic-y enough where plenty of people on the, plenty of non-academics, still don't get some of the stuff that's going on there. But I do think I was able to accomplish some of that, because I have to say, I always get a kick out of when undergrads come and see me, or where I'm, wherever I may be, and I bump into an undergrad who has read my book, and has told me that they found, that my book was super important to them in the sense that it gave them the capacity to talk about stuff that they weren't able to talk about. That this was like the first time that they read actually something in their classroom, and that they found affirmative. And number one, the fact that some have assigned this to undergraduates, that that's amazing to begin with, and the fact that there have been younger folks out there who have read it and have resonated with it, has been terrific. So yeah, so I guess I don't find writing enjoyable. I find writing challenging. But when it actually happens, and others have read it, and particularly people that surprise you, that's where I find the most enjoyment out of all of this. So it's worth it at the end.
So Casey, let's for the audience who is may not have the time to read the book from cover to cover, what would you say for the ordinary Asian American person on the ground is the main point that you're making? And then let's say for the scholars, for those interested in theory, maybe you can flesh out a little bit more of the theory that's driving the main point.
Yeah. All right. So maybe one way of talking about that is, look, I mean, my primary concern with the book and in all the stuff that I've written since the book, or that I'm writing now, or trying to write in Asian American theology or ethics, is the question of liberation, right? It's really, well, let me back up here. It's really the question of what it might mean for Asian Americans to have agency. Now, I think this question is translatable, within other communities as well. But let's just, for our sake of our conversation here, focus on Asian Americans. So, what might agency look like for Asian Americans, given what I've said earlier, about the impact of racism, and specifically, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean for us as Asian Americans to be free? And in the book, what I'm trying to say here is, and this is where I wish I had a copy of the book, but that's okay. What I'm trying to propose in the book is that, if we're interested in agency, if we're interested in the question of freedom, question of liberation, we can't get there unless we have a sense of, again, the social forces, right, that bear down upon us. And these social forces are rather sinister social forces. We can, well, I'll mention some later. And I try to capture, the in a word, what these social forces are under the label of whiteness. We can talk about that later, but that's what I really mean by the force of whiteness on Asian American lives. And so our task is to figure out what these forces are in more particular. And when we do this, I think, how should I put this? I think we have to arrive at the uncomfortable, if not inconvenient, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I'll use that word. Inconvenient reality that that Asian American identity is, it's not just a construct. That's a truism, but it's a wholly problematic construct. And the problematic part of that phrase, I think, is the super important and challenging part. And so, and the reason why it's a wholly problematic construct is because the argument that I try to make is that that as Asian Americans, we're disciplined in two ways. We're either disciplined to be domesticated Asians, or we're disciplined to be pseudo white folks, right? So, and so those are the two major trajectories that that Asian Americans are caught up in contemporary social life. So, as a problematic construct, we need to ask. I'm pointing up two fingers here. Yeah, let's stick with that with two things. Um, so, the first thing that I think we have to ask is what's the logic behind the creation and imposition of Asian American identity? So this is, I think, um, um, one side of our Asian American racial discourse that I think is not articulated enough. It's just not that Asian American identity is created, but it's also imposed on us, right? So the so if we're thinking about the problematic construct of Asian American identity, the first thing that we need to ask is, well, what's the logic behind the creation and the imposition of Asian American identity? And so, in the book, and I don't do a lot of this, but in the book, somewhere in the middle chapters, I allude to how some of this logic really emerges in in true force in post World War II, in our post World War II geopolitical world. So there are um, deep U.S. Geopolitical and financial interests that are at work in the creation of a particular Asian American identity and its imposition on us, and the desire for Asian Americans to buy into that casting of who we are. So, so there's no way that we can avoid geopolitics, particularly Cold War politics, and the rise of financial capitalism in the 20th century and into the 21st century. I think the way I put it again earlier was what's the driving force of the logic behind the creation and the imposition of Asian American identity. So that's the first. So that's the first thing that we have to ask, given the problematic construct of Asian American identity. The second thing that I think we have to ask, the first question, I think, at the end of the day, that's easy. And it's easy in the sense that even if we're not aware of it, once we become aware of it, there are plenty of resources out there to help us to unpack, right, the role of financial capitalism and the role of the Cold War in the creation and imposition of Asian American identity. The second question, however, I think is the harder and perhaps a harder question. And the question is, if Asian American identity is problematic and constructed in the way that I've just described, then we have to ask whether or not Asian American identity is salvageable. This is one question that I try to press in chapter 5, which a lot of people never get to chapter 5 because I don't know, they're probably bored by the time they get to the middle or end of the chapter. But I mean, the end of the book really is trying to ask this, or beginning to ask this question. And a lot of my work that has come after this has really tried to explore this further. But is Asian American identity salvageable? And I was a little, and the way that I tried to struggle with this question, at the end of the book, I think I'm a little ambivalent about the question, but at the end of the day, I think the direction that I lean towards, or lean in, or lean against, whatever the right phrasing is that I'm not entirely sure if Asian American identity is salvageable because of all of the if you will, social structural scaffolding that makes Asian American identity what it is. Because if you identify the scaffolding and you see the scaffolding as the primary logic or culprit or the root cause of the problematic nature of Asian American identity, um, and 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 you want to make it salvageable. You have to ask this question then: is the kind of geopolitics that is at the root of Asian American identity, is that salvageable? I'm not entirely sure. Um, is the kind of financial capitalism that is so pivotal to Asian American identity in the 20th century and into the 21st century, is that salvageable? Um, I'm not so sure. And the reason why this question becomes that much more difficult is because so much of Asian American life is wrapped up in those two social forces. At the educational level and at the professional level and at the level of our careers, the way that we think about what is a just life and the good are so deeply wrapped up in colonialism, if you will, as well as in financial capitalism. I think it's very difficult to think of how Asian American identity is salvageable. Um, so, yeah. So let me just stop there. I think I've been talking for a while. I can
No, it's
give you
it's
guys.
really it's really quite clear. Um, you're circumspect on the salvageability of Asian American identity, given its origin constructed via financial capitalism. And so there's this imbrication between the conditions of the creation, the financial capitalism, with the Asian American identity. And the imbrication means that if it's really difficult to repair the financial capitalism, then it's equally difficult to repair the identity that it created. That's kind of what I'm hearing you saying, Casey. So when we think about Asian American identity emerging out of the Asian American movement in the 60s,
Mhm.
tied with the Third World Liberation Front, and this is a term, Asian American, that was coined against Oriental, and then all those famous images of different Asian ethnic groups locking arms in hand, and this is kind of a fervent social student revolution. I'm curious if you think TWLF thought AAI, Asian American Identity, was salvageable, and is there some distance between you and that originating moment where the term Asian American was created?
Yeah, no, and I totally get the strategic logic in the early days, if I can put it, well, if you can consider the 60s and the 70s, the early days. I totally get it. And there was value to doing that. Um, and I'm not totally writing off the value of doing that today, but I am deeply skeptical though. Partly because the way in which Asian American identity has been employed, although I think powerful at the start, and this is the larger sort of theoretical point that I'm trying to make about the disciplining reality of Asian American life, is that it it gets caught up, or it becomes very difficult. I should put it this way: it becomes very difficult to not get caught up in the way in which Asian American identity is rendered in contemporary life. Um, so so you know so I think in some ways the way that it was invoked has by the time we get to so this is my rendering of my interpretation of what has happened, and I'm sure there are many disputable points about this, but I just want to, just as a broad point, if you will, by the time we get to the 80s and maybe even the 90s, that initial rendering becomes, I think, aiding and abetting a particular kind of liberal multiculturalism that ends up rarefying Asian American life rather than making Asian American life a catalyst for social change, if you will. And not just any kind of social. What I'm talking about here is radical social change, right? Like if my identification, as well as others, I'm not the only one who's saying this. Others who have done this much more explicitly and powerfully than I have, but that really wasn't the goal of my book. Um, if the social logics underneath the creation and imposition of Asian American life is correctly identified, as I have suggested here, then what we need is a radical politics, right? And so, and I think the goal of radical politics of radical politics was certainly the case um, in the early days. But again, because of the disciplining power of white racism on Asian American lives, um, I think it devolved, if you will, or it just became very difficult to avoid these kinds of racial identity traps that became quite sure-footed in the 80s and the 90s, and one could argue still in some sectors today. So this is why I continue to be somewhat cautious about it. In some ways, this is not to, and you can probably still hear some ambivalence in the way that I talk about this, but this is not to say that again, employing Asian American identity for radical politics is a fool's errand all the time. I think it's helpful as a start, right? But if it doesn't allow us to ultimately talk about what a radical politics entails, right? If it distracts us from that, then we have a larger problem. Uh, and this is why I think, in a lot of ways, in my teaching, in the classroom, and in the projects that I'm working on now, why I have become so deeply interested in the ethics and politics of nonviolence, because that's fundamentally tied up with questions of coloniality, empire, militarism, right? The role that capitalism plays in all of that, settler colonialism, and so forth. I mean, right? So if the talk of Asian American identity ultimately prevents us from getting at those things, then it doesn't do its job. And so my question here is Asian American identity up to the task of doing that kind of job? And that's a question that I think is the harder question that we need to struggle with.
In the history from the 60s through the 80s and 90s tells many versions of the politics story. One could say that in the 60s, in the Asian American radical movement, the politics was explicitly driving towards radical social systemic change. But then that in the 80s and 90s, it got domesticated into these multicultural type of projects, which only were shifting chairs on the Titanic, so to speak. And so the history itself of this kind of Asian American discourse has seen a lot of different politics.
Yeah. So I think that's a nice way of capturing the essence of what I'm trying to suggest here, and 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 in that respect, so look, my book has sparked all sorts of reactions, and one, I think, kind of consequence of this book that I don't know exactly how to make sense of, but maybe that's just a coy way of saying I'm not so perhaps I'm not so keen on how it has on keen on what has on this one particular trajectory or appropriation of the book, I should put it, is sort of a doubling down on Asian American identity, that somehow this book has given permission to embrace all things Asian American. I mean that's yeah. I mean that is. I want those who read this book to have a sense of ownership of ourselves as Asian Americans. And so I just want to make that clear, right? But I have encountered those who have read the book and then said, this affirms, if you will, the things that I think of as my Asianness. But what worries me about that is that unless that's coupled with the radical politics, the kind of embrace of our Asianness and the things that we think make up our Asianness in some ways perpetuates the kind of racialized dynamics that I'm trying to paint in the book, right? I'm not so sure how some of the ways in which we're trying to affirm our Asianness somehow gets out of what I talk about again as that twofold racialized consequence, right? The kind of domesticated Asian American and the sort of pseudo white guy phenomenon, if I can put it that way. So yeah, I can see how my book can be read in a way that simply kind of opens the door for an affirmation of my of my or our Asianness and stuff that we think constitutes our Asianness. But that's not really the takeaway that I'm hoping for. I mean, the takeaway that I'm hoping for is, hey, look, we exist under some powerful, if you will, social regimes that bear down upon us. And that phrase I take from Jim Gustafson, who talks about the divine, if you will, transcendence as a reality that bears down upon us. I don't mean to suggest that somehow God is bearing down upon us in this context, but what I'm talking about here is to recognize the ways in which, right, these powerful structures and logics bear down upon us to the point that even our sense of self and our daily practices, and maybe even our religiosity is informed, shaped, delimited by these forces. And who we think we are can't be understood apart from that. And maybe it's too totalizing. Well, I think it is totalizing, if you will, right? Maybe this means that we should go and embrace our boba bubble fabulous lives. Yeah, go for it. Let's drink as much boba as we can. But if that's all that Asian American life amounts to, right? Then I think we've totally missed the mark. If this means that all we should be doing, or not all that we should be doing, but if this renews just a sense of pride in our K towns, Chinatowns, in our struggles to survive, that's all important too. But if that's it, then you've missed the point of the book. It's much more than that.
Yeah, actually I want to pick up on that point particularly because another aspect, and you've talked about this kind of a few times in this conversation, but one of the key arguments you're making is the possibility for, I think you call this in the book, an other regarding self-love. And I'd love to hear
Oh,
more.
you read the last chapter.
Yes, I did. I read the last chapter. One of the people who did. And I really appreciate that last chapter on how you're kind of, because I think one of the things that you're arguing for is that you're engaging with the problem of Asian American identity, but you also don't want to leave the book in a sense with this kind of with a pessimism. You still kind of want to argue and think about, okay, Asian American identity is problematic, it's very complicated, but we can still do something. And I think I'd love to hear more about like when someone finishes reading the book, gets through that 5th chapter, they close the book. What do you want people to take away from it? And I just love for you to expound on that more.
Yeah. I wish I had used this phrase. And maybe I'll do it in my next book. But but the question that I think I want folks to take away at the end of the book is to ask this question of, what would it mean to be unburdened by our Asianness? And I'm going to sound totally paradoxical here. It doesn't mean that we stop being Asian, right? But what are the possibilities of Asian American life once we are unburdened by our Asianness, right? So in asking this question of what would Asian American life be like if we were unburdened by our Asianness, is what I hope folks do, and this is where I appreciate you saying that you didn't feel pessimistic at the end. And ultimately, I don't want this to be a pessimistic. I want this to be a bridge to something much more optimistic. Well, I don't even like the term optimistic, but much more radically constructive. So appreciate you saying how you felt that this wasn't necessarily a pessimistic ending, but this as an inspiration for Asian Americans to go and experiment in radically new ways, to take that, to ask, well, what would it mean to risk everything? Maybe that's one way of putting it, right? Um, and again, I think that is such a difficult question for us as Asian Americans, and maybe for all sort of immigrant communities, but or for all communities just in general speaking. But I think that's really hard because so many of us, um, not all of us, some of many of us have been here for many generations, but but many of us have also been here only, this is, we're first generation or 1.5s or second. I'm first generation. I came here when I was 4, right? And because of that immigrant, if you will, experience, there's so much pressure for us to embody a particular vision of the good, and feelings of of guilt or a sense of debt or whatever, I think often fuels that that motivation, especially as we get older in life, to embody a particular vision of the good, so that we can show our parents that their dreams have come, all their sacrifice have come true, or was worth it. That we're here to also help them as a thank you, all that sort of stuff, right? And that has led to all sorts of, I think, choices and pathways in terms of how we understand merit, educational achievement, the kinds of careers, right? All that sort of stuff. And I'm caught up in this too. I'm not saying that all of a sudden I've given everything up, um, but we have to struggle with this question of, well, is this in fact the good life that we think that all of us are pursuing? um, being more, being a little bit more charitable, if you will, right? Being more, I don't know, just being a little bit more selfless. Does that, maybe self-sacrificing a little bit more here on the edges, if you will? I mean, is that good enough? I'm not. I'm deeply uncomfortable with whether or not what we think is the, the, the vision of the good is in fact the vision of the good. I think we need to push ourselves. And again, like I said, this is a challenge for me too, right? I'm not saying that I'm living the kind of um, uh, life that I'm suggesting what my book is suggesting, right? So it's a challenge for me as well. So when I ask this question of, what does it mean to be unburdened by our Asianness? What does it mean to try to figure out what it means to be Asian, unburdened by our Asianness? What I really am trying to motivate us to do is to ask, to go and take some risks, or to think really hard about the kinds of risks that we need to take, the kinds of the ways in which I think we have to disattach ourselves from certain things that we are so deeply attached to, that we think are elements of the good life. And this is where I think the Christian tradition is deeply helpful, and essential. Particularly, the lives of the mystics, the exemplars that we have in the Christian tradition, in terms of radical politics. I find the witness of folks like Dorothy Day and Daniel Berrigan. I'm still struggling, right, to figure out how their witness should also manifest in my life, as well as society in general. So tradition and so forth. So yeah. So I think that's super helpful. And then of course you have Yuri Kochiyama and the Asian radical. In this regard, I should say there was this one master's student who wrote, not at PTS, elsewhere, who wrote I think, just a terrific thesis, using my book as a springboard for thinking about how Ignatian spirituality can help us to think about, to identify the kind of uh, socio-political, socio-economic attachments that drive our visions of the good, and to interrogate them through these spiritual practices. So, that kind of stuff, I think, I'm really gratified to see as a consequence of my book. I'm
Ign-
rambling, talking too
Ign-
much here.
Ignatian spirituality. That's a shout out to our mutual colleague, Professor Bo Karen Lee.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Well,
That's right.
we could have a future conversation about Asian Americans and Ignatian practices and the common good. Casey, this last kind of set of reflections and musings about the good life of Asian American Christians, that's a really thought provoking question to conclude on. Jan and I thank you so much for spending the time to chat and reflect, to kind of offer a postlude since this book has been out for 5 years now. Your considered, thoughts and ideas and probing questions are so appreciated. Thank you for having this conversation with us.
Yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and for having this conversation. So it's good to see you in this format.